I wonder, can you think of a time when you felt like you didn't belong? Maybe you just had that feeling, or maybe it was even a time you could think of when you were left out on purpose, or excluded, or even bullied. I don't know, I think is there anyone who hasn't? It's a pretty universal experience, isn't it? And I'm not going to ask you right now to share those stories, but I'm curious, can you think of, like, what are the feelings that you have in those moments when that has happened? Fear, isolation, discomfort, embarrassed. Yeah, a lot of not the nice feelings that we want to have. I wonder, can you also maybe think of a time when you felt like you did belong, when you were included and accepted, just as you are? Yeah, is it harder to think of those moments, or no? I mean, often as humans, we sometimes have a way of, I think, focusing or remembering more strongly the negative experiences we have, right? They kind of imprint on us. But hopefully we've all had the other experience too, right? Where we just felt loved, accepted for who we are, right? That we didn't have to earn that or do something, that we just were okay and we were included. And how do you feel? I heard a couple of words. How do you feel in those moments when you have felt like you belonged? I heard someone say loved, yeah. Inspired, warm, fuzzy, embraced, content. Yeah. So as humans, one of the things that we were created with is that we do have a need to belong, right? To be in relationship with others and to be loved and accepted, right? Not for what we can offer or bring or do, but just because of who we are as God created us to be, right? And I wanted to bring back our little paper doll. I had a smaller one this week, right? And I just love the way these look with the heart between their arms as our hands are joined. For me, this is just that symbol of what it should feel like, right, when we belong somewhere. Today, we're going to hear the story of Ruth. And I don't know if how familiar that story is with folks. It comes from its own book in the Bible, the book of Ruth, and it's only 4 chapters long. We're just going to hear the first part of that story today. But I think her story will help us to think about what it looks like to belong, right? Even across differences, and how when we open our arms to those who are different from us, how that can be a great source of blessing. So as we prepare to hear Ruth's story this morning, let us take a moment to pray. God of the people, your servant Ruth showed great love when she clung to Naomi. Teach us to show great compassion. Give us open hearts and help us to turn to you when we are in need. Amen. You may be seated as we listen to Bonnie tell us this story from the book of Ruth.
May we be equipped by these words to walk in love for God, ourselves, our neighbors, all people, and all God's creation. During the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. A man with his wife and 2 sons went from Bethlehem of Judah to dwell in the territory of Moab. The name of that man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the territory of Moab and settled there. But Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. Then only she was left along with her 2 sons. They took wives for themselves, Moabite women. The name of the first was Orpah, and the name of the second was Ruth, and they lived there for about 10 years. But both of the sons, Mahlon and Chilion, also died. Only the woman was left without her 2 children and without her husband. Then she arose along with her daughters-in-law to return from the field of Moab, because while in the territory of Moab, she had heard that the Lord had paid attention to his people by providing food for them. She left the place where she had been, and her 2 daughters-in-law went with her. They went along the road to return to the land of Judah. Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go, turn back, each of you to the household of your mother. May the Lord deal faithfully with you, just as you have done with the dead and with me. May the Lord provide for you, so that you may find security, each woman in the household of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. But they replied to her, "No, instead we will return with you to your people." Naomi replied, "Turn back, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Will there again be sons in my womb that they would be husbands for you? Turn back, my daughters. Go. I am too old for a husband. If I were to say that I have hope, even if I had a husband tonight, and even more if I were to bear sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you refrain from having a husband? No, my daughters, this is more bitter for me than for you, since the Lord's will has come out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth stayed with her. Naomi said, "Look, your sister-in-law is returning to her people and to her gods. Turn back after your sister-in-law." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to abandon you, to turn back from following after you. Wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do this to me, and more so, if even death separates me from you." The living God is with us.
And with all creation, thanks be to God. This fall, we have been making our way through God's story as it's recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures. And this morning, as the opening verse of our story tells us, we have arrived to the time of the Judges. This is a period of time immediately following the Israelites' entry into the Promised Land. And so for those who were here last week, right, that's where we were with Moses and the people looking to the Promised Land before entering. But now, this is several hundred years this period of the Judges lasted. This is a time when they were ruled by these leaders called judges, individuals who were appointed by God, and these leaders were often both military leaders and arbiters of justice. And it's a time in the people's history that was marked by some moments of relative peace, but also times of warfare, as these 12 tribes of Israel seek to carve out a life for themselves in this land. So it's against the backdrop, this is the backdrop, that Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons make their way to the land of the Moabites during a time of famine. And the fact that they chose to go to Moab should be a sign, a clue to us that things really were that bad in their homeland, because relations between the Israelites and the Moabites weren't exactly friendly. And soon after they arrive to this land, tragedy strikes, right? When the father, Elimelech, dies, but the family, they stay. We don't know why. The famine perhaps was still going on. So they stay in Moab, and each of the sons marry a Moabite woman, and they make a home for themselves in this foreign land. Tragedy then strikes 2 more times, right? Ruth and Orpah are now left widowed along with their mother-in-law, Naomi. And so when she's unable to support herself, Naomi makes that decision that she needs to return home. She's heard that things are better there now, and so without a husband or sons to provide for her, she knows she needs to make her way back to her ancestral homeland where she still has family ties. And in spite of her advice to her daughters-in-law to stay there, to do the same, to go back to their families, right, to their blood relatives, Ruth insists on sticking with Naomi. And Orpah does it first too, right? Naomi really has to insist that they don't come with her. Orpah stays behind, but for Ruth, that bond of love is so strong, it would seem, that no matter what might lie ahead for her, right, she is going to now be a foreigner, a Moabite, coming into Israelite land. Whatever lies ahead for her, Ruth knows that she belongs at Naomi's side. I just wanted to make a little note about our setting of the story here too. Ruth's story is set during the time of the Judges, but it actually was told and written down about 500 years later, during a time that was also a time of upheaval for the Jewish people. About 500 years later, in the aftermath of the Babylonian exile, right? So this is after a time the Babylonians had come and conquered, taken a bunch of the people away into exile, but now they've been allowed to return. And as they returned home, there was a big debate about whether it was okay to intermarry with people of other cultures and traditions, of other nations. And in particular, whether it was okay for Israelite men to marry foreign women. And so I think it's helpful to keep that in mind too, that this was a story that was told at a time where that was an issue that had to be figured out. And Ruth's story was told to remind this post-exile community about these faithful outsider women in their own history and the gifts and the blessings that they had brought. So that's an added piece that's helpful to keep in mind with this story and what purpose it had in being told and retold. And I think we need these reminders. We need reminders about people like Ruth, these outsiders who were faithful and a blessing to their community, because we so easily fall into this pattern of forming groups, right, of us and them. And doing that, right, we do that because it helps us find a sense of belonging by finding our people, right, that we fit in with. But when we have groups, it can also lead us down that path of fearing, even hating, not trusting those who are different from us, right, the thems. Can be scary. It's impossible to watch the news of what's happening right now in Israel and Palestine and not be overwhelmed by, I think, just sadness and grief at what is happening there. The horrors that Hamas has done to Israeli civilians, and now the many innocent Palestinians who are dying in response. The death toll is just rising, and we know it's going to keep rising, and it's just heartbreaking, right? Heartbreaking to see that. And the history of this conflict is complex. I think we ought to be wary of those who offer simplified black and white analyses of what's going on there, right? We know that deep harm has already been done. It's going to continue to be done by both sides. And as the violence continues, right, we just feel that possibility for peace moving ever further away. It's hard. It's hard to witness that. And as I think about what's happening there, as we're thinking about Ruth's story today, one of the things that has me reminded of is that underlying that conflict, and I think underlying really any conflict, any war that happens, part of what's under that is that desire, that human need to have a place where we belong, right? To have that place where we can live and thrive in safety. Certainly that's not all of it. Again, there's a big, complex history with what's happening with this particular conflict, but I can't help but think that that is a piece of it, right? That we all want a place where we can be safe and thrive for ourselves and our families, for our children, right? And that desire is one that will always be out of reach when we can't make room for us as well as for them. And Ruth's story, what it does is it offers such a beautiful counter-narrative to that story of fear and danger. Right? Ruth and Naomi are these two women from completely different cultures, and they find this true and deep belonging with one another that transcends their cultural differences. They have this love and belonging together that trumps any tribal ties. And we only heard the first part of this story today. If you have a chance, like I said, it's only 4 chapters. If you want a little bit of homework this week, it's an easy bit of homework. Go and read the rest of this story because it's beautiful. Right? When Ruth arrives in Judah, she finds herself swept up in a bit of a biblical romance, you could say. So I won't give all the details, but a relative of Naomi is a man named Boaz. Right? He notices Ruth, and he watches out for her. As in the story, he talks about how he knows that her as an immigrant and being this widow, that she's vulnerable. So he warns, the men who are working for him to leave her alone. He watches out for her, and they end up together eventually. Right? There's some pieces in there that I'm going to skip over today, but they end up together. They get married. They have a son, and their son Obed has an important role to play because he becomes the grandfather of King David. So we have Ruth, right? This foreigner, this immigrant, this Moabite woman who is actually the great-grandmother of King David, right? And she's also the ancestor of Jesus when we look at his genealogy in the New Testament. This outsider becomes this model of faithfulness and such a blessing for the community that embraced her and accepted her. And there's a lovely verse at the end of the book of Ruth where the women of Bethlehem praise her. And when they tell Naomi that her daughter-in-law, that Ruth, is better for her than 7 sons. And you just have to imagine, this is a patriarchal culture, right? To say that this daughter-in-law is better than 7 sons is the highest praise, right? It's interesting, one thing you'll notice too in the book of Ruth, that God doesn't really make much of an appearance, at least not in the way of an active participant or character. But where God does show up in this story is in the loving kindness that is embodied by these characters across cultures and borders, right? God is embodied in Ruth's loving kindness for Naomi, in Boaz's loving kindness for Ruth. The promise of Ruth's story is that we experience God's loving kindness through our relationships with other people. It's not God's desire or intention that we find belonging by pitting ourselves against others. Right? God is not for us and against all others. God is for us and for them, whoever those them are to us. Right? God loves everyone, everywhere, no exceptions. And so true faith is about joining God in God's love for everyone. One of my regular sources for news is the weekly media criticism podcast, Canada Land. And in this week's episode, they were discussing, they look at the media coverage of various issues. So of course this week, they were looking at what the media coverage has been of the situation in Israel and Palestine. And the guest who was on this week was Quebecois journalist Émilie Nicolas, and she had the most beautiful words about peace. But I want to close this for us today. Because she was criticizing how in almost every interview she was listening to, the interviewer is asking folks, do you have hope for peace one day? Makes sense, why they would ask that question. But she was bothered by this, and this is what she said about why it was bothering her. Right? Peace is not just something that's out there. Peace is something that all of us do. Peace is something that we choose every day when we wake up. Peace means holding space for people in your heart. Peace means listening to one another. Peace means not bullying people. Peace means being able to ask questions about other people's motives rather than assuming them. Rather than hoping one day there might be peace, how about we just do peace as an action? How about we try to do peace every day? As we sit here this morning with the good fortune to live in Canada, far removed from the violence that we have no power to stop, what we can do, and I think Émilie Nicolas gives us something that we can do right here, right now, in our own little spheres, we can do that work of building peace, right? We can open our hearts in loving kindness to the people around us, strangers and friends, knowing that this is what God desires of us. This world where all are welcomed, where stranger becomes family, and where everyone has a place to belong. Amen. So as we continue to give thanks for Ruth and for her story today, we will sing for our hymn of the day, number 419, For All the Faithful Women. And I'll invite you to stand as you are able as we sing together.